The biting wind rattled the windows of the lined shack as Ruth Ainsworth stared into the endless white expanse, realizing with growing dread that the blizzard had sealed her fate. It was the winter of 1878 in the Wyoming Territory, and what had begun as light snowfall during her desperate flight from Cheyenne had transformed into nature's fury, trapping her in this abandoned shelter with the most infuriating man she'd ever encountered. "You're burning through the wood too quick," Ruth said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "At this rate, we'll freeze by morning." Across the small room, Killian Grayson barely acknowledged her words as he carefully arranged another log on the modest fire. His tall frame was hunched toward the warmth, his usually pristine rancher's clothes now worn and dusted with snow. "Miss Ainsworth," he finally said, his voice carrying that particular drawl she'd grown to recognize over the past 6 hours, "I've weathered more Wyoming winters than you've had hot meals. Trust that I know how to keep a fire." Ruth bit her tongue. At 24, she wasn't some naive girl, despite what this stubborn cowboy might think. She'd come west with purpose, with dreams not to be trapped in a lined shack during the worst blizzard in years with Killian Grayson, the very man whose cattle operation threatened everything she was trying to build. "I wouldn't be here at all if you hadn't chased after me," she muttered, looking away from those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her pretenses. "Chased after you?" Killian's laugh held no humor. "Madam, you rode off with my maps. Maps that detail every water source on my property." "Your property?" Ruth stood suddenly, her fists clenched at her sides. "Those springs belonged to my father's homestead before your cattle-barren friends drove him out. I'm merely reclaiming what's rightfully mine." The tension between them crackled like the fire that now represented their only hope of survival. Outside, the wind howled its warning neither of them was going anywhere soon. Killian rose to his full height, the firelight casting dramatic shadows across his weathered face. At 32, life had carved its story into every line around his eyes, into the set of his jaw that spoke of determination and losses Ruth couldn't begin to imagine. "Your father sold that land fair and square, Miss Ainsworth, after your employer threatened to burn him out." Her voice trembled with the injustice of it all. "My father died believing he'd failed us. I came back to set things right." Something shifted in Killian's expression, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or recognition. He turned away, moving toward the small stack of supplies he'd managed to bring from his saddlebags before the horses had bolted. "We've got bigger concerns than water rights at the moment." He gestured toward the window where snow was piling against the glass. "This storm ain't letting up anytime soon." Ruth sank back onto the rough wooden chair. He was right, of course. Their shared history, their opposing claims, none of it would matter if they froze to death before morning. "How long do you think we'll be trapped here?" she asked, her voice softer now. Killian studied the ceiling as if calculating something. 3 days, maybe 4. These Wyoming blizzards don't surrender easy." He glanced at their meager supplies. "We've got enough food to stretch, barely. Water we can melt from snow. It's the wood that concerns me." Ruth nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. The lined shack was little more than a single room with a small fireplace, built as temporary shelter for cowboys working the range. It wasn't meant for extended stays, especially not during the heart of winter. "I'll take first watch on the fire," she offered. "You should rest." Killian raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her offer. "I'm fine, Miss Ainsworth." "Ruth," she corrected him. "If we're to be trapped together for days, you might as well use my given name." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy with something neither was ready to acknowledge. "Ruth," he finally said, testing the name as if tasting something unfamiliar. "I'm Killian." That night, as the temperature dropped further, Ruth learned the first of many truths about Killian Grayson. Despite his gruff exterior, he insisted she take the only blanket while he kept vigilance by the fire. Each time she awoke in the darkness, she found him there, steadfastly feeding small pieces of wood into the flames, preserving their lifeline with methodical care. By morning, the world outside remained an impenetrable white void. The wind had settled somewhat, but the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy curtains. The door was completely blocked, and frost patterns decorated the insides of the windows. "We'll need to clear some snow from the roof," Killian announced after their modest breakfast of jerky and hardtack. "Too much weight and we'll have bigger problems than the cold." Ruth nodded, rising to help. "I can climb out the window if you'll boost me up." Killian stared at her as if she'd suggested dancing naked in the snowdrifts. "That's not happening. I'll go." "Because I'm a woman," Ruth challenged, her chin lifting defiantly. "Because you're wearing a cotton dress and those ridiculous city boots," he countered, nodding toward her footwear. "You'd lose your toes to frostbite before you cleared the first foot of snow." Ruth glanced down at her impractical boots, a reminder of how unprepared she'd been for this journey. She'd left Boston in such haste, determined to reclaim her father's legacy, that she'd given little thought to the practical realities of Western life. "I have an extra pair of socks," Killian offered, his voice gentler now. "Not pretty, but they'll help keep you warm." The simple kindness caught Ruth off guard. This man who stood opposed to everything she'd come west to accomplish was offering her comfort with no expectation of return. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the thick woolen socks with genuine gratitude. While Killian braved the elements outside, Ruth explored the lined shack more thoroughly. In a small trunk beneath the single cot, she discovered a cache of supplies: candles, matches, a few tins of beans, and most precious of all, several books. Someone had thoughtfully prepared this place for emergency shelter. When Killian returned, snow melting in his dark hair and his face ruddy from exertion and cold, Ruth had a small pot of beans warming by the fire and a book open in her lap. "You found supplies," he observed, shedding his snow-covered coat. Ruth nodded. "Enough to make our stay somewhat more comfortable." She hesitated before adding, "There's a copy of Whitman's poems. Would you like me to read aloud later? It might help pass the time." Something like surprise flickered across Killian's face. "You'd think a rough cowboy like me wouldn't care for poetry. Do you?" she asked, genuinely curious. A half-smile lifted one corner of his mouth. "My mother taught literature before she came west. She made sure I knew there was more to life than cattle and horses." The revelation shifted something in Ruth's perception of this man. He was no longer simply the obstacle standing between her and justice, but a person with his own story, his own depth. As night fell again, they found themselves sitting closer to the fire, the book of poetry between them. Ruth's voice filled the small space as she read, her Boston accent giving the words a musicality that seemed to entrance Killian. His eyes never left her face, though she pretended not to notice. "My father used to recite Whitman," she confessed during a pause. "He said the poems reminded him that there was vastness and beauty even in struggle." "Was he right?" Killian asked softly. Ruth considered the question, the firelight playing across her features. "He died before I could ask him if he still believed it, after losing everything, after being forced from his land." "What did he lose exactly?" Killian's question was gentle, but Ruth felt its weight. Everything. His self-respect most of all. She closed the book. "He came west with such dreams, Killian. He was going to build something lasting, something he could pass down. When he was pushed out, something broke in him." Killian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I need to tell you something, Ruth, about your father's land." The sudden seriousness in his tone made her stomach tighten. "What about it?" "I'm not working for Blackwater Ranch anymore. I haven't been for almost a year." His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "I bought the northern section of your father's old property. I'm running my own operation now, small but growing." The revelation struck Ruth like a physical blow. "You own it, my father's land, part of it. The springs you're so interested in there on my property now." Ruth stood abruptly, needing distance. "So you're not just the hired hand doing Blackwater's dirty work. You're the man who profits from my family's loss." "It wasn't like that," Killian insisted, rising to face her. "I didn't know the history when I purchased it. All I knew was that it was good land with reliable water, and I could finally afford to stake my own claim. And now that you do know," his eyes never wavered, "now I want to understand what really happened. The story I was told doesn't match what you've described." The honesty in his voice gave Ruth pause. She'd come west burning with righteousness, certain that the villains in her father's story were one-dimensional characters. Standing before her was a man asking her to consider that there might be more to the truth. That night, sleep eluded Ruth. She lay on the cot, listening to Killian's steady breathing as he slept on the floor near the fire. The storm outside seemed to mirror her inner turmoil, violent and unpredictable, yet somehow containing the seeds of something new beneath the destruction. By the third day of their confinement, a strange domesticity had settled between them. They rationed their supplies carefully, shared stories of their lives, and took turns tending the fire that had become the heart of their small, temporary world. Ruth found herself watching Killian's hands as he worked strong, capable hands that seemed equally adept at managing cattle and gently turning the pages of Whitman's poems. "Tell me about your dream," Killian said that afternoon as they sat side by side, watching the flames. "What were you planning to do with the water rights if you secured them?" Ruth hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her aspirations. "I want to establish a school," she finally admitted. "Not just any school, but one that teaches practical skills alongside literature and mathematics. I believe education is what will truly tame the West, not guns or cattle." Killian's expression was thoughtful. "In Cheyenne?" "No, closer to my father's old homestead. There are families scattered throughout those hills who can't send their children to town for schooling." Her passion animated her face, bringing color to her cheeks. "Children who will grow up without the tools to build better lives unless someone brings education to them." "A noble dream," Killian said softly, "one that requires land and water," Ruth pointed out. "Resources I no longer have access to." The implication hung between them, but instead of defensiveness, Killian's expression showed genuine consideration. "What if there was a way to honor both our ambitions?" he suggested. "My ranch needs to succeed, but it doesn't need all that water. And I've seen too many good cowboys who can't read a contract or calculate their proper wages. A school nearby would serve more than just children." Ruth stared at him, searching for deception and finding none. "Are you proposing some kind of partnership?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we were meant to be trapped here together," Killian said, his voice lowering. "Maybe this storm is forcing us to find a solution neither of us would have considered otherwise." The idea took root in Ruth's mind, growing alongside another, more unsettling realization somewhere in these 3 days of shared confinement. Her perception of Killian Grayson had fundamentally changed. That evening, as they sat together reading by candlelight, their hands accidentally brushed. The simple contact sent an undeniable current between them, causing both to pull back in momentary surprise. "I think the storm's weakening," Killian observed, clearly changing the subject as he moved toward the window. He wiped away the frost to peer outside. The winds shifted direction. "If we're fortunate, tomorrow might bring clear skies." Ruth felt an unexpected pang at the prospect of their confinement ending. "That's good news," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Killian turned to study her, his expression unreadable. "Is it?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "When we return to Cheyenne," Ruth began carefully, "what happens to our conversation about the school, about sharing the water rights?" Killian's approach was slow, deliberate. He knelt before her chair so they were at eye level. "Ruth, I meant every word, but I think we both know that something else has happened here, something neither of us planned for." Her heart thundered in her chest. "Proximity in crisis often creates false intimacy," she said, repeating words she'd read in some psychological journal back in Boston. A smile touched Killian's lips. "Is that what you think this is, false intimacy?" "I don't know what this is," Ruth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 days ago, I thought you were my enemy. And now she saw kindness in the way he rationed the firewood to ensure their survival. She saw intelligence in his thoughtful questions and compassion in how he listened to her dreams. She saw a man who challenged her assumptions while respecting her determination. "Now I'm not certain of anything except that I don't want to be your enemy," she confessed. Killian's hand reached for hers, hesitant until she met him halfway. "Then don't be." That night, as the fire burned low, Ruth made a decision. She slipped from the cot and moved to where Killian lay on the floor. Without a word, she spread the blanket over both of them and nestled against his side. His arm came around her, protective and warm, and for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Ruth felt she might have found her place in this wild land. Morning brought weak sunlight filtering through the frost-covered windows. The storm had indeed broken, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly silent, as if the world had been born anew. "We should be able to make it back to town today," Killian said as they shared the last of their coffee. "The main road's about 2 miles east. Even with the snow, we can walk it before sunset." Ruth nodded, feeling both relief and regret. Their time in this small shelter had changed something fundamental between them, but the real world awaited with all its complications. "Killian," she began, needing to clarify what lay ahead. "About my father's land," he stopped her with a gentle touch to her hand. "I've been thinking about that. The southeastern corner of the property, the part with the smaller spring, it borders directly on my grazing land, but I don't use it much. It would be a perfect location for a school." Hope bloomed in Ruth's chest. "You'd be willing to sell it to me?" His eyes crinkled at the corners. "I was thinking more along the lines of a gift, a partnership of sorts." Ruth's breath caught. "I couldn't accept such charity." "It's not charity," Killian assured her. "Think of it as an investment in the future. My future cowpunchers will need schooling after all." His expression grew more serious. "Besides, I've been alone on that ranch long enough. Building something together sounds a whole lot better than facing each sunrise on my own." The implications of his words were clear. This wasn't just about land or water or even a school. This was about two people who had found something unexpected in a lined shack during a blizzard. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Grayson?" Ruth asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. His smile was slow and warm. "Eventually, I hope to propose something more personal, Miss Ainsworth, but I believe in building on solid foundations." The journey back to Cheyenne was arduous, the snow reaching past their knees in places. They walked close together, sometimes holding hands for balance, sometimes simply for the comfort of connection. Ruth told Killian more about her vision for the school, while he shared his dreams of building a cattle operation that would prioritize fair treatment of the land and the men who worked it. By the time the town's buildings appeared on the horizon, they had sketched out not just a plan for the school, but the beginnings of a shared future neither had imagined possible days earlier. "People will talk," Ruth observed as they neared the outskirts of Cheyenne. "A respectable woman doesn't spend 3 days alone with a man without consequences to her reputation." Killian considered this. "Would you like me to speak with Reverend Thomas when we get back? He could perform a quick ceremony if that would ease your concerns." Ruth stopped in her tracks, snow swirling around her skirts. "Killian Grayson, if that's your idea of a proposal, it leaves much to be desired." He laughed, the sound bright in the crisp air. "No, madam, when I propose marriage, you'll know it. That was merely a practical suggestion." "I've had enough of practicality," Ruth decided. "I came west for adventure and purpose. I'm not afraid of a little gossip." Killian's expression sobered. "I don't want to complicate your plans for the school. A woman's reputation matters out here, perhaps even more than back east." "Then we'll simply tell the truth," Ruth said. "The storm trapped us. You kept the fire burning, and I—" She paused, suddenly shy. "And you," Killian prompted. Ruth met his gaze squarely. "And I discovered hope in a place I least expected to find it." Spring arrived in Wyoming territory with its characteristic fickleness, warm, sunny days, interspersed with sudden snowstorms that reminded everyone that winter never surrendered easily in this land. On one such perfect day, when the prairie was erupting with wildflowers and new grass, the small schoolhouse near Killian Grayson's ranch opened its doors for the first time. Ruth stood proudly at the entrance, watching as children from neighboring homesteads arrived on horseback or in wagons. Some came from as far as 15 miles away, their families choosing to camp nearby during the week rather than lose precious learning time to daily travel. Miss Ainsworth," called 10-year-old Emma Jenkins, running ahead of her father's wagon. "Pa says I can stay through Friday this week. Ma packed extra supplies." Ruth smiled warmly at the enthusiastic child. That's wonderful, Emma. We'll be starting our science lessons tomorrow. You'll be able to participate in all the experiments. More families arrived, each greeting Ruth with increasing familiarity and respect. In the 3 months since she'd begun organizing the school, she'd visited every home within riding distance, explaining her vision and earning the trust of even the most skeptical parents. A commotion at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. Killian had arrived, but not alone. Behind him rode 4 men, cowboys from his ranch, looking somewhat uncomfortable in their clean shirts and nervously clutching their hats. "Miss Ainsworth," Killian greeted her formally, though his eyes held the warmth that was reserved for her alone. "I've brought some additional students if you'll have them. My men have expressed interest in your evening arithmetic classes." Ruth surveyed the cowboys, noting their mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Gentlemen, you're most welcome. We begin at 6 o'clock sharp on Tuesdays and Thursdays." The oldest of the group, a weathered man with gray at his temples, nodded respectfully. "Much obliged, madam." "Boss here says knowing numbers might keep us from getting cheated at the cattle auctions." "Mr. Grayson is a wise employer," Ruth replied, catching Killian's eye with a private smile. The day passed in a flurry of activity, organizing students by ability rather than age, establishing expectations, and beginning the first reading lessons. By afternoon, Ruth was exhausted but exhilarated. This was everything she had dreamed of and worked toward. As the children departed and the schoolroom emptied, Killian returned. He had been absent most of the day, tending to ranch business, but now he stood in the doorway, watching as Ruth arranged books on the small shelf he had built for her. "Successful first day?" he asked, entering and closing the door behind him. Ruth nodded, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Beyond my expectations. Even Mr. Henderson's boys participated, and he was certain they'd be too wild for schooling." Killian approached slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "You've accomplished something remarkable here, Ruth." "We have," she corrected him, turning to face him fully. "This school wouldn't exist without your support." The corner of his mouth lifted in that half-smile she'd grown so fond of. "I provided some land and lumber. You provided the vision and the courage. And you provided the hope," Ruth said softly, remembering those days in the line shack when her entire understanding of her purpose in Wyoming had transformed. "When I came west, I was so focused on righting a wrong that I couldn't see the possibility of building something new." Killian took her hands in his. Over the months since the blizzard, their relationship had developed with deliberate care. There had been Sunday rides, shared meals, planning meetings for the school that inevitably extended into conversations about books, ideas, and dreams. They had built a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that had gradually, inevitably, deepened into something more. "I have something to ask you," Killian said, his voice taking on an uncharacteristic nervousness. Ruth's heart quickened. "Yes." From his pocket, Killian withdrew a small wooden box. "I told you once that, when I proposed, you'd know it wasn't just a practical suggestion." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I've practiced this speech a dozen times, but now that I'm standing here, I find myself without words." Ruth smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "Then allow me to help you find them." "Are you asking me to be your wife, Killian Grayson?" Relief washed over his features. "I am, with all my heart." "Then my answer is yes," Ruth whispered. "Yes to building a life together, yes to facing whatever comes our way, yes to everything a future with you promises." As Killian slipped the ring onto her finger, Ruth remembered that terrible blizzard with gratitude. What had seemed like disaster had been the beginning of everything good in her new life. "I love you," Killian said simply, drawing her into his arms. "From that first night by the fire when you read Whitman and challenged every assumption I'd ever made about Boston school teachers." Ruth laughed against his chest. "I love you too, even though you were infuriatingly right about how to maintain a fire during a blizzard." Their wedding took place the following month, a joyous occasion that brought together the entire community. The schoolhouse was transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, and Reverend Thomas traveled from Cheyenne to perform the ceremony. Ruth's students sang a song they had secretly practiced, and Killian's Cowboys presented the couple with a handcrafted rocking chair for their porch. As Ruth and Killian exchanged their vows, a gentle spring rain began to fall, not the violent storm that had first brought them together, but a soft blessing on the land and their union. That evening, as they stood on the porch of the small house Killian had built adjacent to the schoolhouse, watching the rain nourish the earth, Ruth leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. "I was thinking," she said thoughtfully, "that we might expand the school curriculum next year to include more natural sciences. The children are fascinated by the ecology of the prairie." Killian's arm tightened around her waist. "Always planning for the future, Mrs. Grayson." The name sent a thrill through her. "Our future," she corrected him, "which reminds me the eastern section of your property would be perfect for the new breeding stock you've been considering. The grass there." Killian silenced her with a kiss. "Tomorrow," he murmured against her lips. "We have the rest of our lives to build our dreams together. Tonight is just for us." As they retreated into their new home, the rain continued its gentle pattern on the roof, so different from the howling blizzard that had once trapped them, yet serving as a sweet reminder of how adversity had brought them together. In this wild land where nature's fury could change everything in an instant, they had found in each other the strength to weather any storm, the vision to create something lasting, and the love to make every challenge worthwhile. Years later, when their own children gathered around the fireplace on winter evenings, Ruth and Killian would tell them the story of the blizzard and the lined shack where two strangers with opposing purposes discovered that sometimes being trapped is the first step toward being truly free.